Hi everyone, Brian Matias here, and I'd like to welcome you to episode number 4 of Perfect Inspiration. With this week's shot, we're going a bit grungy. This is actually the very first shot that I took on my very first visit to Belchertown School out in Belchertown, Massachusetts, which is kind of on the border of Massachusetts and New York State. And it was just fantastic. If you're into this kind of UrbEx or urban exploration photography, you really can't ask for a more fun scene to really cut your teeth on this type of photography. It offered a lot in terms of the visuals here. Now, before I go into the kind of the lesson of why I shot this or framed it the way I did, the first thing we really should do is tone map. This is an image that perfectly illustrates the limitations of a digital camera sensor. A lot of times when you see a tone mapped HDR image, you see the after image, and so you don't really get an idea of why we would tone map to begin with. But here, this illustrates it perfectly, actually in a nice kind of linear line from up here through here. So we'll start with the highlights, and if we zoom in, you can see that the highlights themselves are totally blown out. They're gone because it was so bright. And then if we go to the opposite side of the scale, our shadows are totally gone as well. You can't see anything through that doorway. And the reason for that is the camera was metering somewhere in here. This was the midtone. So in order to get the most amount of exposure information, it had to sacrifice highlights and shadows. Now, if we actually go to the grid view in Lightroom, you can see here that I have my brackets. You can see overall we have better highlight information here because it's exposing for the highlights. It was a gray overcast sky, so there really isn't much detail here. However, there is good detail. There's data here. It's not just pure blown out information. And as we start exposing through, here's where the fun happens. Is as we get to the shadows, now we're starting to see information through this archway, through this doorway over here. And you can see that it's actually a whole another door. And within there is a whole another room. So this is really important because you want to maintain that information when you present your image. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take all of these brackets here and I'm going to send them over to Photomatix so that we can start tone mapping. Alright, so we're in Photomatix now, and you can see just right off the bat I hit the default button here to reset everything to default. It's just instantly better in terms of now we have information over here in the dark shadow areas, and we have detail throughout the image. Now you can see if we look at the histogram that we're bunching up, we're kind of blowing out our highlights up here in the window. So the reason for that is for some reason the default value in Photomatix for the white point is 0.25%. I'm going to wrangle that all the way down here. And you can see that it kind of helps a little bit, but for the most part, again, there wasn't that much information to begin with. I'm also going to start by bringing the strength up to 100% for the overall tone mapping algorithm, and I'm going to start playing around with various sliders here. So I'm just kind of getting it to a nice kind of representative exposure where we have good detail throughout the image, but it doesn't look stylized. And that's really important here, is that when I do this tone mapping, you'll always hear me say this on any image that's tone mapped. I never achieve stylization here. I'm not looking for a style. I'm looking to just get information for me to stylize, to get a nice even exposure. I also like to start my image to be brighter than normal. And in last week's image of the diner, you'll remember that the reason why I do that is because when I stylize, we tend to darken the image. So here I'm giving myself a little bit of a handicap to start working. When I'm done, I'll hit Save and Re-import to return back to Lightroom. Alright, so here's one of the original brackets, and you can see again we've got our blown out highlights and no shadow information. But if we go to the tone mapped image, all of a sudden now we have all this good information throughout the image, and it looks the same. I mean, all we did was we brought out the detail. So we're not going for style here, we're simply going for an even exposure, and that's what we really should concern ourselves with whenever we do tone mapping. Now before I go into stylization, let me take a minute to talk about why I framed the shot the way I did. This image is all about providing depth and dimension to the viewer. So if you were standing with me, the very first frame that I initially started to take but didn't actually expose for was I was actually hugging this wall right here, so that my camera and lens, kind of you would get this long line for the wall, and then it would just break off this way. And before I started exposing, I kind of stopped for a second and I walked over a few feet to where the camera eventually ended. And I saw all these leading lines that we were creating just by standing here. So we have these leading lines over here in this top corner, then the leading lines through here, and then further leading lines this way. So you've got all of this kind of movement starting over here, moving through the frame, and then ending on the left side of the frame. The other advantage to positioning the camera here as opposed to against the wall is all of a sudden now you have you see this wall here, or rather this room, and then you see another doorway, and you see doorways through here. So it's kind of like it's a feast for the eyes. The eyes get to explore all these different rooms, and it really brings you to this location, which I find really compelling. So that's kind of why I always think before you get to a new location, instead of just plopping down your camera and start shooting, take a minute or two and really survey your scene and scout for the shots. Once you start shooting, your mind will start going into this really awesome creative cycle of seeing other things. So it's really just kind of getting the lay of the land first, seeing what the scene has to offer you, and then capitalizing on that. So with that, now I'm going to send the image to the Perfect Photo Suite by going to the File menu, Plug in Extras, and selecting Perfect Photo Suite. A few things that I might do here before I begin. While I'm in Perfect Layers, I might use the Refine brush and start just kind of removing certain information that I don't want. I tend to kind of minimize some of the clutter in the foreground here. It's just kind of one of the things that I like to do. So I'm just going to get rid of some of these wires and see how it looks. And you can see that we're doing a really nice job of kind of blending in the surrounding pixels so that we no longer have that information. Now, I'm not going to spend too much more time, but I just wanted to show you some of the things that I do like to do. Now I'm going to send the image over to Perfect Effects by clicking on the Effects module from the selector at the top, and we're ready to stylize. So one of the things that I like to do in this type of a scene is actually take a black and white layer and blend it using one of the blending modes because I find that it does a really nice job of bringing out contrast. You can use any one of the black and white effects that we have pre-built for you, but in this case I'm going to hide the effect bar and build my own black and white effect by going to the effect options and selecting black and white. Now I'm going to bring up the contrast here, and then I'm going to adjust the color filter until I expose for the part of the scene that I really like, which is kind of right around here, the default value. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the blending options. Actually, before I do that, I want to apply kind of a sepia toner, kind of a light tone, and now I'll bring up the blending options. So with that, I'm going to bring my blending mode and start cycling through. So you can see multiply does a nice job, soft light, hard light. So I'm going to go to multiply actually, and I'm going to bring the strength to 0, and then just start bringing it up a little bit. And this is going to be my base. So you can see what I've gotten here was this kind of nice base for the image. I'll hit Add to create a new layer, and then I'm going to bring my effects bar back up, and we'll go to the Movie Looks category. By default, I'm thinking to go to something like Thermopylae, just to see what we get here. And I'm going to bring that down to 0, and then start bringing it up. Now, for me, I want to create the room over here as its own separate kind of player. So I'm going to take my masking brush, and I'm going to mask out the Thermopylae effect from the walls and from the ceiling, and I'm going to not necessarily spend too much time on the mask, but I want to do the best job that I can to mask it out. And so you can see here what I'm doing. I'm not necessarily going for the floor because the floor will be consistent in here and in here, but the wall and the ceiling are in fair play. I'm going to bring the mask up just to make sure that I got everything that I needed. It's looking pretty good, and I think I'm ready to continue on. So I'm going to hit Add to move on. And now for this room, I might complement it with something a bit cooler. So I'm going to go to something like maybe Cyberpunk. And again, when it applies, I'm really only paying attention to this room here. I'm going to go ahead and bring it to 0, and then bring it up here. And then what I can do to easily get the effect only applied to the wall and the ceiling is I can go back to Thermopylae, go to Masking, and select Copy Mask. Now I can go back to the Cyberpunk effect, paste that mask, and then invert it so that it's only applied there. And so you can see what I'm getting at now is like we're getting this really cool kind of like a competition in color between the two rooms. And that's kind of what I want. Now what I'm going to do is I'll hit add, and we have to apply some tonal contrast. I mean, that goes without saying here because it's such a texture-rich room. So I'll bring it up here. I'm going to drop the local contrast down a little bit, the actual slider that gives the texture. We talked about that in last week's video. And I'm also going to drop the strength down overall to 0, and then we don't need that much. That's the thing. Just like with tone mapping, any effect you apply is best done in moderation and in kind of small increments. So it does a really nice job of bringing out that detail. So I'm going to hit add. Now I'm going to go ahead and give myself a glow. It might work, it might not work. I'm going to start with this grunge glow. I'm going to bring it down to 0 and then start bringing it up a bit. And then I might play with the blending option. So here I'll bring my blending modes down. Something like soft light works really nicely here. And again, it's giving us a really moody atmosphere. And notice what that glow does to the room back here. Really, really does a nice job of kind of setting itself apart. We'll hit apply. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll hit add and go to the vignette category and then add a subtle vignette, a really, really subtle one. Bring it to 0 and just a tiny bit to burn the edges. So here you can see if we toggle the before and the after, what we were able to achieve, it's actually pretty compelling. And I'll hit apply now to save the image and then return back to Lightroom to finish things up. Now that we're in Lightroom, I'm going to finish things up in the develop module here just to refine some stuff. The first thing I want to do is bring out this little guy right here, and I'm going to do that by using an adjustment brush. I have the exposure selected, and usually with the exposure, I'll start brighter than I normally would. I'll drop the brush size down a bit, and I'll start painting on him. And really just the body and the head. If it's actually looking pretty cool now, but you can adjust that, accordingly. So I'll stick here with actually a pretty bright brush. I'm also going to create a new brush. I'll stick with the same exposure settings, but I'm also going to bring up the contrast and the clarity and brush on certain elements that I want to bring out, like that exit sign. And also, I'm just looking around the room here, these beams. I definitely want to bring out some things. And that's really important too. When you're finishing up your stylizations, you want to bring out some of the elements in the scene. I'm going to hit new and then create another exposure brush for this room back here. So I'm going to brighten this up. Now again, I brighten it up. I have a stronger brightness setting than I normally would, and that's just because it shows me the impact. Now I can go and drop that down to something a bit more reasonable, but it helps it stand out. Create a new one, and now I'm going to do something like bring out a bright exposure brush, increase the color temperature, which is new for Lightroom 4 to give it a little bit of a warmer tint, and I'm going to bring the clarity up really high, and I'm going to start painting on these panels over here. And just get here and kind of these areas here, and I'm a big fan of just getting those little areas to play as their own kind of part in this ensemble cast. Now you can see that it's pretty bright, which we don't want. So I'm going to adjust that after the fact by bringing the exposure down. But they do stand. You see how they almost glow? They look kind of iridescent a bit. That's very cool. And I can continue on here and just kind of draw these on these certain areas here. And to me, this is where I really kind of appreciate the works of digital photographers out there who take the time to really make those little changes that have the pop needed for an image. So you can see there what we've done. We kind of added our own little character. It's still a bit too bright, so I might drop this down to 0.10. And that's looking pretty good. Now, again, if we hit the backslash key, we can see the changes before the develop module and what the develop module has done. The last thing I'll do is I'll actually close out the adjustment brush. I didn't really touch any of the global settings, so here I might bring an overall boost in contrast, overall boost in clarity, not that much, that's a bit too strong, and then a tiny bit of exposure, something like 0.05. And that looks like it's about done here. Be sure to download this actual image. I'm including the tone mapped image here for all of you to play with. You can download it from the link right below this video and just have some fun in testing out combinations of effects and processing styles. Thanks a lot, and I'll be sure to see you next week. Bye-bye.